Hey, are you listening to Ambush in the Night?
Yeah, it is such a beautiful song, right?
Well, I wouldn't say it like that.
Reggae is all about calm, freedom, love, drugs, all that stuff. That helps me disconnect from the world and all its problems, right?
I think you are misunderstanding the song and all the concept of reggae music. The song you are listening to came out at a time of political tension on the African continent. This song criticizes imperialism and calls for action in the name of liberation from Europe domination. In general, it expresses the sentiment of black people throughout history. I will not call that disconnection from the world. In fact, it is a wake up call. That is the real meaning of reggae.
I don't know, it has a nice beat. Don't kill my vibe.
Well, just let me inform you about the context in which this song was developed. I know the impact will be much greater. How did the domination of African lands by Europe begin? Colonization of Africa began in the last quarter of the 19th century when seven Western countries that were Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, and Italy did an agreement to avoid wars between them in the partition of the African continent recently discovered and explored. That was how in the Berlin Conference of 1884, Africa was divided between these European countries in the process called Scramble of Africa, in which it wasn't considered any of the kingdoms and tribes that were already established. The recent colonies, because of their military approach and the consideration of inferiority of African citizens, were authoritarian and bureaucratic. In consequence of imperialism and colonialism, Africa was affected economically, politically, and culturally. Africa lost control over the exploitation of its natural resources, provoking a recession that was leading them to a social and economic crisis. Plus, their cultural values such as language, organization, and customs were replaced for the Western ones. Domination conditions persisted during the first part of the 28th century, but nationalist sentiments seeking to claim sovereignty and gain independence is increased, until they reached their climax during the years of 1960 and 1975 with radical systemic changes on the continent as colonial governments made the transition to independent states. And what was the decolonization of Africa? African decolonization is based on three different situations: the desire for freedom of native people, the European distraction from international affairs, and the famous resentment against racism and inequality. In the decades of imperialism, all the abuses of power taken by the imperialist states began to generate social discontent and create political tension. Social leaders who had studied in Western countries and had a global understanding of the problem were the creators of a movement called Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is a political, philosophical, cultural, and social movement that promotes African union, the defense of the rights of African people, and the unity of Africa under a single sovereign state for all Africans, both from Africa as well as the African diasporas. This was the voice of change that saw the liberation and union of the continent. This movement hosted the Pan-African Congress, where leaders from Europe, the United States, and Africa gathered to discuss the future of the continent and made a significant advance in the concession of independence in a diplomatic way. On the other hand, the world was facing two world wars that affected and weakened the world powers in economic and political terms. This was one of the main factors by which the colonizing countries did not apply great resistance to the independence efforts. they did not have enough resources. Furthermore, at the end of the Second World War, nations became aware of the atrocities that war amounted to. Therefore, peace treaties were signed and human rights were created. An idea promulgated by the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, stipulated that all countries had the right to decide how they wanted to be governed. The dissemination of these ideas throughout the world allowed a negotiation by the African countries to regain control of their territory. However, not all the nations gained independence pacifically. There was a group of nations that reached the point of causing a war to obtain power over their territory, in which their attempts to rebel and become independent were repressed by the existing colonizing governments. Some examples of these were the War of Algeria and the War of Rhodesia, the actual Zimbabwe. Although countries in Africa were gaining independence diplomatically, the Rhodesia Front government's UDI project shattered the African nationalists' goal of attaining political independence. The reason for this was the aspiration of the white minority in power who wanted to preserve their privilege. This led to the armed uprising of the militias of the main African political groups against the pro-British local government that consisted in a civil war that lasted over a decade and left over 30,000 deaths, mostly insurgents and civilians.
Africa unite, 'cause we're moving right out of Babylon.
Colonization and imperialism are concepts that have marked the history of Africa and continue to have their repercussions in today's society. The circumstances that history shows as arguments of the colonizing countries to carry out colonization correspond to the desire to find new sources of raw materials, establish new markets for trade, spread Christianity and Western ideas, and create strategic military bases. However, to do this, European countries completely ignored the native civilization and set about exploiting its natural resources and attacking its humanity. That had its reason on the fact that they considered black people as uncivilized and inferior, condemning them to slavery with a lower quality of life than those of the colonizers. That is how the white race settled itself as the dominant race and transferred native Africans to different parts of the world as slaves. Time passed and societies developed, however, not their thoughts regarding race. Even after the abolition of slavery and the independence of Africa, discrimination against black people persisted. Racism is one of the major social problems that spread around the world, where even though slavery was already prohibited, black people were still victims of attacks on their human rights and were separated from the white race, as was the case in countries such as the United States and South Africa. On the other hand, today it is possible to understand the conflict that exists in Africa due to the era of European interventionism. Many of the wars that are presented in Africa today are based on the geographical limits between countries and the separation and mixing of different cultures. Today, the impact of colonization process explains the multiple conflicts that are identified not only in Africa but around the world. In conclusion, Africa throughout its history has had the intervention of colonization and imperialism, during which they sought control of their territory and caused a division between native cultures and tribes that ended up affecting their identity. The independence of Africa was a product of the weakening of world powers and the independentist and Pan-Africanist movements that fought for the autonomy of African nations. The consequences of these two concepts can be seen even after the independence of Africa, where the ideals with which the people were colonized assigned roles that allowed discrimination between races. In this way, the effects that history has had in people's life are essential to understand our reality nowadays.